Hey guys, it's me, it's me, Jay. I'm making another video today about the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., aka MLK. Um, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, very influential figure in the United States for bringing about the end racial segregation in this country. After the Civil War, which was a bloody civil war that was fought for 5 years in this nation, African American people of African descent, were emancipated from slavery. But that didn't end the struggles of African American people because, as a result of the court case of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1898, it established the separate but equal law in this country, which stated that the two races, black and white, had to be separated from one another. But it was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. who set out to change all that. And he set out to create a different world. And he set out to strive for racial and economic justice in this nation. First, he was the son of a minister. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., was a minister at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. And his father actually spoke out against the rise of Nazism in Germany and the discrimination against the Jewish people in Germany. So, in my thinking, that really inspired the son to do the exact same thing because his son, like I said, became a crusader for justice in this nation and a crusader to end the system of the unjust racial system of Jim Crow. In 1955, a woman by the name of Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat because she was tired for a white man, as was customary in the South. And that sparked the first of Dr. Martin Luther King's boycotts of the major form of transportation in the city of Montgomery, Alabama, with the Montgomery bus boycott. After that, he went to the March on Selma, in which he marched hundreds of people. And you could see on TV for the first time ever the mistreatments. People in other parts of the country could see the mistreatment of black people as they had dogs sicked on them, as they had people hosing them down, people treating them like just complete second-class citizens. And Dr. Martin Luther King's approach, which he was inspired by Mahatma Gandhi, who did this in India. This was how Gandhi achieved independence in India. Was a nonviolent approach, ahimsa, what they call it in Sanskrit. And Dr. King and the people at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, like Ralph Abernathy, for example, was also inspired by this. They said if we strike back, they're going to just look at us as just angry black people that just want to take revenge on whites. But if we be diligent and we respond with nonviolence, then people can really see the extent to what our form of discrimination our discrimination is, our oppression is. It'll make them look like the bad guys, the southern mayors and governors like Bull Connor or George Wallace will really look like the bad guys when you have little kids having water hose sicked on them and police dogs sicked on them. That'll really change the perception of the people. And keep in mind, much like the Vietnam War, for the first time ever, we always had political protesters in this nation, but we never saw those political protesters manifest on TV. In the 1960s, when Dr. King was active, we saw them on TV. That was different. It made people say, wow, that's really bad. I knew the South was segregated, but I didn't know it was that bad. So, and then in 1963, Dr. King had his famous March on Washington, where many people who were sympathizers of him from up north also came, and plenty of people that were sympathizers of him, that both black and white, came um, to support him, and that's when he made this "I Have a Dream" speech. I have a dream that one day, uh, little white boys and little white girls will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And he was really challenging America to live up to its creed. We told in America back then, as well as now, when we go to school, that our founding documents say all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And what Dr. King was challenging us to do was finally make that that promise, that dream, of reality by granting African Americans full rights and ending the Plessy versus Ferguson rule, ending the separate but equal status, so-called separate but equal status that America had operated under since the end of the Civil War, and finally to achieve equality. But, and of course, with the pressure put on President Johnson at the time, President Johnson did pass um, civil rights legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were passed. But even in Dr. King's mind, it wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough, and he continued to protest, and he continued to fight against not only racial injustice but economic injustice as well, because he understood that the problem was bigger than local, and he began to protest against the Vietnam War, and he began to protest against President Johnson's himself's actions, because with President Johnson, although he was strong on civil rights, and he and President Kennedy made a pledge to end Jim Crow and to end segregation in the South, he was also he was very war hawkish. He was he was gun ho about going into Vietnam, and he even lied and said that the USS Maddox was attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of Vietnam, so we could escalate and we could send more troops in. But Dr. King was against that. Dr. King said, "How can we have how can we have justice at home and not have justice abroad?" Dr. King was for nonviolence across the board. And also, Dr. King was for including not just his struggle was not just the disenfranchised African Americans of the South. Struggle was going to include people of the North and people even of other races that were economically disenfranchised. This was the point of his Poor People's March that he was going to go on right before he passed away. Dr. King was beginning to shift into a more globalistic way of thinking. Not that he was abandoning, because people say, a lot of people that are scholars of Dr. King, they'll say, well, he was beginning to abandon his nonviolence approach for a more militant approach that was becoming more popular with groups like the Black Panthers in the late 60s, early 70s. I don't really necessarily think that's true. I think he was just thinking more so internationally. And he was also thinking more so about economics. He was thinking, how are we going to have legal justice? How are we going to have an end to legal segregation without having an end to economic uh, economic injustices. The fact that um, slavery existed for so long in this country, and then after slavery, 100 more years of segregation really set the black population in this country back a ways, and we can't really have true equality if we don't have economic equality. That was one of the things that Dr. King was pushing for towards the end of his life. So I believe that as Dr. King became more international and started to really speak out against the power structure, even the one that helped him out, like LBJ, he became more of a target because he became more radical, especially like with the anti-Vietnam stuff. It was radical. It was very radical, and they didn't want to hear from a quote unquote Negro preacher stuff about being against the war in Vietnam, the injustices of the war in Vietnam, because they felt that it was not his place to speak on that. And even though Charles Lee Ray is the one convicted of murdering him in 1968, I believe, much like the assassination of John F. Kennedy a couple of years earlier, and the assassination of his brother Robert Kennedy that same year, and also the assassination of Malcolm X in 1965. Plenty of political assassinations in the tumultuous years of the 1960s. I never did a decade in review retrospective for that one because I would just be looking at it from history like I am now with this video, and sometimes history is a little biased in the way they report things. Keep that in mind. But like when they sanitized Dr. King, every time you speak about racial injustice now in this country, they always say, well, why are you talking about racial injustice? You should be more like Dr. King, who said, judge a person not by his color, but by the content of his character. But you're just signaling out one speech. Dr. King made plenty of speeches. Dr. King talked about economic injustice. The modern day Republicans that try to co opt the narrative of him that he was a quote unquote Republican or that his dad was a Republican, they don't think of first of all the fact that after the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, the parties switched sides. Okay, so the people that were opposing Dr. King at that time, you know, like Governor George Wallace, they switched to Republican. Strom Thurmond, who walked out of the Democratic National Convention in 1948 and declared on the mic that the Southern people would never ever share their pools in public places with black folks. They switched sides to the Republican Party. So don't give me that, number one. But my point is how the dominant society tries to co-opt certain figures and try to demilitarize Dr. King. Dr. King, yeah, he wasn't for violence. He never abandoned his idea of nonviolence, and that nonviolence was the most effective form of revolution that could happen. But he also started to realize that it was bigger than civil rights, that it was about human rights, and it was about economic justice, just like the talk about reparations is now. The talk about reparations is about economic justice. How do we correct the sins of the past in a way that's um, tangible? Because just giving people rights, that's not okay. You've given me rights, but I have nothing. I can't do anything with those rights because I don't have access to education. I don't have access to medical resources. I don't have access to 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 the things I need to live a good quality of life. And because of racism and because of slavery, those rights were denied a certain portion of the population, and that's undeniable. And just to use Dr. King's legacy to stifle future political um, future political discussions is shameful. And I think even though they hated him in his lifetime, like they hated Dr. King in his lifetime, people, Republicans try to act like they loved it, Dr. King. Republicans and conservatives try to act like they loved Dr. King back in those days when they were the ones. James Earl Ray was the far right conservative who had him killed. So don't try to co-opt him just because he's sanitized right now. You know what I mean? Don't do that because you do that with rock and roll. You do that with hip hop. You do that with everything. Don't do that. Don't use his legacy to try and stifle future political talks. And don't do it anachronistically either. Don't say, "Oh, Dr. King wouldn't agree with. He wouldn't agree with Black Lives Matter. He would be against Black Lives Matter." How do you know that? How do you know that? Are you doing a seance right now? Calling up his spirit, asking him if he agrees with Black Lives Matter or the current protest, or Dr. King would be pro-Trump. No, he wouldn't. Trump is out there launching wars in Iran, and like Colin Kaepernick said, out there snatching black and brown bodies for foreign lands. Dr. King was against that. He was against expansionist, imperialistic wars like in Vietnam. So don't try to co-opt this legacy to fit your own political agenda. Please don't do that. But anyway, yeah, I love Dr. King. And also, they didn't even want to make his birthday a federal holiday back in the 80s under Reagan. Reagan was forced to do it. You had senators like Jesse Helms, that asshole, who are out going around there claiming that Dr. King was a communist. Yes, Dr. King was influenced by certain leftist ideologies, but Dr. King was no communist. He was an American. He believed in bringing out the best in the American system and calling American people to a reckoning, reminding them what it's all about, just like Abraham Lincoln had done. You had the American revolutionaries, and you had the abolitionists, which was culminated by Abraham Lincoln, and then you had Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement. And from that point on, you had other activists calling from the legacy of Dr. King to remind us that Dr. King's fight was for justice. And it's not over now. And it's not ever going to be over until there is freedom, justice, and equality in this nation for all people, including the disabled, including LGBT Americans, and yes, including Dr. King's own people, Black Americans. Peace.